Thank you so much, Susanna. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really thrilled and honoured to be able to speak to Le Monde Diplomatique's friends here in London. I'm particularly pleased that I'm not being asked to speak in French, in which case this would be a much shorter and more painful talk. As Susanna says, War on Want has been very much part of the fight for trade justice over the years. And we've been a very active member and a proud member of the trade justice movement in this country, which has sort of followed some of the major trade and investment debates across the years. And my own engagement with that has again been for many, many years looking first at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and the big international mobilizations against the WTO from Seattle, the 1999 conference onwards until now. But I'm really pleased to be able to speak tonight on the TTIP, as we call it, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, also known as TAFTA by some people, because the idea is it's meant to create a transatlantic free trade area, so a transatlantic free trade agreement, if you want, to try to create that. And I thought I'd just start off by filling in the absolute basics. Susanna's already mentioned a couple of them, but the negotiations towards TTIP were really set in train from February of this year, so it's quite a new thing. In his State of the Union address, President Barack Obama announced that there would be this ambitious and comprehensive new agreement to create effectively a customs union across the Atlantic. And the first round of the negotiations took place in July. The second round of negotiations was due to take place last month, but it was one of the more pleasant casualties of the crisis in the federal states in the United States that they couldn't do that. They had to actually pull out of the second round of negotiations while they sorted out their own internal problems and pulled themselves back from the latest fiscal cliff. We've just heard, literally today, that the next round of negotiations are therefore going to take place as of next week. So this is very much a live issue which is going on right at the moment. And the TTIP is being negotiated, as I say, between the US on the one hand and the European Union on the other. And I think that's important as a starting point to recall this is something which is going to apply to all 28 member states of the European Union, including our own. But it is negotiated by the European Commission. The European Commission, the unelected body which is situated in Brussels, basically has competence, as they call it in the language, to engage in these negotiations on our behalf, our Europeans' behalf. Except, of course, as we will find out, it is not on our behalf at all. And one of the key challenges that we face is that we, in this country, or the French in France, or the Germans in Germany, we do not have our own trade policies, and we do not have our own political engagement with it. It is all going through Brussels, and that is extremely hard if you want to have any leverage in trying to change it and bring it back to anything which would approximate a more progressive path. And it's very interesting to see that while we don't have any democratic levers, perhaps, over the TTIP, it's still something which our government quite likes to promote. So at exactly the time when the negotiations were meant to be happening last month, Nick Clegg flew across the Atlantic to promote TTIP to the US states. One of the things that they're always very worried about in the USA is that while they can do these federal deals, they might find it more difficult to roll that out across the 50 states of the USA. And Nick Clegg had taken a document that had been prepared by the UK government in order to try to convince every single one of the 50 US states that TTIP would be to their advantage. And the big claims that are made, the big claims that are made in support of TTIP is that basically it will reboot the economies of Europe and the USA after the financial crisis and the economic recession that has followed from 2008. The idea is that they would boost our trade massively, $120 billion in 5 years, lead to an extra 2 million jobs, These are the figures that you will read time and time again. They come from a study done by the CEPR, the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and you'll find that it's referred to again and again and again and again. Almost every article you see will say, quite sort of uncomplicatedly, it's great, it's going to give $120 billion in all this extra growth, it's going to have 2 million extra jobs. But actually those figures have already been rubbished. They've already been shown to be completely without foundation. They're results of an econometric exercise into which various figures have been ploughed in at the front, and therefore you get certain answers at the back. The reality, as Susanna was hinting, the reality is that TTIP is a massive attack on all of the social, environmental, and food safety, and the jobs, the labour markets. It's an attack on basically the social structures that we hold dear. And it's an attack not by the US on the EU or by the EU on the US, but it's an attack of capital on society. Capital against labour, and capital against the environment. And I think it's really important as we go through this discussion to think of it not in terms of international relations, which is how we've often looked at the trade negotiations. You know, what's it to do with Brazil versus China versus the European Union versus Japan, but actually to look at what it actually represents in political economy terms between capital and labour, capital, community, capital and the environment. And in that respect, TTIP is really a realisation of a long-held dream for a lot of corporations that have been involved in the trade debates over the years. And I just want to step back, just briefly, to give a little bit of background as to what TTIP represents in terms of the longer trajectory of trade negotiations since the Second World War. As many of you will know, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was set up, which formulated a series of negotiations in different rounds of negotiations over the years. It started with a very small club, mainly of richer, more industrialized countries, and then grew, and each of the different rounds had a name. So you had the Geneva round, and you had the Annecy round. You even had this wonderful moment where you had the Torquay round, so the British Riviera got its place on the international trade history. And then the major shift came in 1986 with the launch of what was known as the Uruguay round. From 1986 to 1994 was the Uruguay round. And it made two enormous shifts, really. The first was that it engaged many more countries. So the vast majority of countries around the world, which were now WTO members, were part of those negotiations. It wasn't just a sort of rich man's club, but it became a much broader engagement. But the second and really crucial thing about the Uruguay round is that it expanded the negotiations beyond their original remit. From the end of the Second World War, really, international trade negotiations had been about things. They'd been about goods, coffee, or it had been about iron or steel or things, basically, the goods trade. And that is what had really kept it going. On negotiations in round after round had tried to lower tariffs between these goods, so that the import taxes that goods face when they go from one country to another. And that had been the real focus. The Uruguay round really went a stage further. And it said it's not just about trading goods. What about all the services that are traded around the world? All of these invisibles which are traded around the world. Like, for example, architecture. If you're an architect who goes from Germany to the United States, your services have been traded, if you look at it in those terms. So services were put on the agenda. And that includes a huge range of things which we would not consider to be commodities to be traded on international markets, like public services, health, or even education, water. All of these services suddenly come within the compass of world trade talks. Also then, it's not just about the tariff barriers you meet at the border. It's not just about import taxes on goods. It's also about the rules and the regulations and the standards which also we would see to be critical for our social existence. The things that we would hold most dear in our lives are also drawn into the trade negotiations because they can seem a barrier to trade. And these non-tariff barriers became absolutely central to the way in which trading partners negotiated with each other. So it wasn't just a question of saying, we'd like you to reduce your tariffs on goods, we also want you to reduce any of the non-tariff barriers which interfere with our trade. And that will come on to very, very strongly in the concept of TTIP, in the context of TTIP. The final thing that the Uruguay round did is it ushered in the existence of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was born on the 1st of January 1995. And the WTO created, as they hoped to do at the end of the Second World War, it eventually created the forum in which negotiations at the multilateral level could continue into the future. And they tried to launch a new round in Seattle. They eventually launched a new round of talks in Doha, which, as you may know, ploughed into the sand fairly quickly and have bumped along ever since without making much progress. The other thing that the WTO did was introduce a dispute settlement mechanism, which meant that countries could bring each other to effectively an international trade court if they were adjudged to have restricted trade between other trading partners. While the Doha round was crashing into the sand and not getting anywhere, you saw this much greater turn towards bilateral trade agreements, so between country and country or between region and region, and also bilateral investment treaties. These have always been held to go alongside the multilateral ones. It's not really an either-or. If you think about the United States, it also negotiated NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, with Canada and Mexico at the same time as it was doing the Uruguay round. So these things shouldn't be played off against each other. But as the Doha round crashed into the sand, what you saw is more and more effort being given to the bilateral negotiations. And this was particularly the result of our own Peter Mandelson, who, as you may remember, when his career went belly up in this country, he was transplanted into Europe and made the trade commissioner in the European Union. And he made one of his sort of great legacies this new bilateral turn, a very aggressive, as he called it, a hard-nosed approach to trade negotiations with individual countries and individual regions around the world. And in 2006, you saw the launch of this new Global Europe strategy, which said, look, we're having quite a lot of difficulties at the WTO. We still would like it to work at the WTO, but we need to be clear, we've got to push it through bilateral negotiations as well. And that has been the gospel, really, for the European Union ever since. Pushing through bilateral negotiations and trying to create this international network of agreements, both on trade and investment, which will almost do the job of the WTO, but in fact can often be much more ambitious, much more far-reaching, and much more pro-corporate than even the WTO was. Right, so that, by way of background, leads us to TTIP. So if you're thinking again, we've come from this situation where the multilateral has sort of failed in various different circumstances. We're now gone bilateral. We're not just talking about trade in goods, we're talking about the full panoply of trade negotiations and all of the different sectors of our economies. The idea of the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, was really first given momentum in the 1990s, and it was the brainchild of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which is a group of the sort of top 40 chief executives of European and US businesses, which tried to push this as being their way of working towards a free trade area where they could trade across the Atlantic without fear of being impeded. And so that was really its genesis. But it was in the last few years, with the establishment of the Transatlantic Economic Council in 2007, which is an intergovernmental body, that the Transatlantic Business Dialogue really came into its own. It becomes the business group which informs those government-to-government talks and gets them to start concentrating on building this free trade area. And there was a document brought out in April of last year, even before we'd heard about these talks, where all of these groups, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, the US Business Roundtable, and also the European Roundtable of Industrialists, they all say, we are calling on our governments to give us the boost we need to push for this big new free trade area and to sweep away the barriers that cause us trouble when we're trying to make extra profits across the world. And this sense of it being driven by a corporate agenda is absolutely critical, particularly for those of us in Europe. The European Commission was forced to give out a series of documents which showed that in the period from the beginning of last year, so 2012, before these negotiations had even started, the European Commission entered into 119 secret meetings with business groups, individual companies and lobby groups in Brussels in order to prepare their remit, to prepare their mandate for what they were going to negotiate on. And if you look through all of those different documents, you see all of the lobby groups, the European Services Federation, the chemicals lobby groups, the fresh foods lobby groups, basically everybody you can think of, and a whole lot of individual companies as well, queuing up to tell the Commission what they wanted to see in the negotiations. And the Commission takes that information, and that is what informs what it has to say. Critically important to see this. The European Commission is not like a sort of a normal government body in advanced capitalist economies where there is a partnership with capital, and that partnership is in flux, and they also try and balance it perhaps with other stakeholders. The European Commission does not have to play that role. It is not elected. It takes its policy directly from companies, and then it will have the occasional sort of consultation meeting with civil society, with trade unions, with NGOs, or with pressure groups, trying to sort of see if they can go through the motions as to what people feel about it. But the dictation of the policy comes directly from the companies and the business lobby which swarm around Brussels. And that's why you end up with a pro-corporate mandate for the European Commission to take in to these negotiations. And what I would like to say is, for everything that I'm saying here, there is a wonderful resource which I really recommend to you, which can give you much more chapter and verse than I'm giving here. It's called A Brave New Transatlantic Partnership, and it's written by the Seattle to Brussels Network, which is one of the international bodies in Europe, which Warmont is a member of, which does a lot of really good stuff. It's freely available on their website, A Brave New Transatlantic Partnership, and the network is called the Seattle to Brussels Network. And quite a lot of the content that I'm going to be just coming up with now, and just introducing some of the problems that TTIP presents, can be found in much better detail in that document. Right, so much for the background. What about the content? What is it that's actually in this TTIP? Well, firstly, as I said, it aims to be a comprehensive and ambitious, far-reaching trade agreement which covers as broad a range of elements as it possibly can. It wants to have market access, increasing the reach of corporations into all of the bits of the market that it may not find it has reach at the moment. So this completion of the world market, that concept which we've known for 150 years, is being pushed forward very, very strongly in that respect. It's on goods, so the goods trade between Europe and the USA, and it's on services. But what's also interesting to think here, the goods trade between Europe and the USA is already practically free trade anyway. There are no tariff barriers in its way. So it's not as if they're going into this in order to try to reduce tariffs between each other. It's clear they have another agenda. And that second agenda is about the regulatory issues or the non-tariff barriers. So looking across the whole piece as to what might be preventing them from trading, might be preventing them from engaging in the other markets as successfully as they'd like. And then the third thing is this whole issue of the rules of trade, on intellectual property, of capital account liberalisation, and the other issues like that. So ultimately, TTIP covers all of trade. It also covers all of investment. These investment rules under which corporations are allowed to set up their own activities, their own operations in a third country. Those are covered as well. Not just the foreign direct investment, which is about setting up, but as broad an understanding of investment as possible. So foreign portfolio investment, where you just invest a much smaller amount, usually understood to be under 10% of the equity. That's also included. Even property, that's included. Basically more and more rights for investors coming in. The other area is government procurement. The public contracts that local or regional or national governments engage in. These are also there, and this is a glittering prize for corporations. If you think the millions and millions and millions which are involved in local government contracts, in regional county council contracts, and the state contracts in the US, and at the national level, this is big money. And so that's been included as well. One of the other interesting things on this is that the negotiations take place entirely in secret. So we know nothing about these negotiations, and the sorts of documents we have by which we're able to put all these things together come from leaks. So we have a leaked copy of the European Commission's mandate of what they're actually trying to achieve there. Again, all of these documents are available on the Seattle to Brussels network website. But it's nothing which actually comes out officially. And this idea of secret negotiations at Brussels has been a bugbear of our attempts to try to get a fairer trading system for years and years and years. The interesting paradox is that one of the things on their mandate is greater transparency. And you think, well, that's good, at least they've heard us. But no, of course, it's not greater transparency as we would like it to be. Transparency in terms of these trade negotiations means that if in the future you want to change any of the rules governing trade or investment or anything like that, you have to consult with business first. So business, not us, but business gets to see all of these things before they're ever put out, even as a possibility for consultation elsewhere. So transparency in their world is very much the looking glass world of pro-corporate trade negotiations. And the final thing to say about the overall bit of it is that they want to be very swift. They realise that as you get bogged down in trade negotiations, like the WTO has been, your chance of success declines with it. And what they've said then, when they launched it, is we want to have these over and done with by the end of 2014. Which in terms of these type of negotiations, which are incredibly complex, even with all of the trade lawyers and experts they have with them, is a bit pie in the sky. But clearly, their ambition is really to push these things through before anybody can raise enough of a stink about it that it starts getting more problematic for them. And what I want to do in the last major section of this talk is just run through a few of the areas in which TTIP is going to prove a real threat to what we understand to be the social model of our societies, or indeed the environmental side of it as well. And I've just chosen 4 or 5 of the top-line sectors which are most obviously engaged in this. There are lots and lots more, and I'm sure that people can bring them up in the discussion. But the first area, which has for a long time been a bone of contention between the European Union and the US in relation to trade negotiations, is food, and particularly food safety. I don't think perhaps we completely realise, living on this side of the pond, we don't realise how different the food rules are in Europe and the USA. But one of the long-term problems has been that the European Union has blocked imports of beef from the US and Canada, because the vast majority of beef in the US and Canada is produced using bovine growth hormones. And these bovine growth hormones have been suspected of being carcinogenic and have been basically rejected by European Union scientists as not being desirable within our food chain. And the US has been, and Canadian farmers have been absolutely up in arms about this for years and years and years, and taken cases to the WTO, which they have won. The WTO has said, you cannot put your public health concerns over the trading interests of these farmers. You have to subordinate them because the trading interests of these farmers come first. You cannot distinguish between like products just in terms of how they've been produced. But similarly, we also have animal welfare regulations over here in Europe that simply don't pertain in the States. We also have a resistance to GMOs, genetically modified food, which again, in the US, they consider to be a block on trade. And Monsanto and the US trade representatives have specifically said, we consider these blocks on GMOs to be unnecessary and we're going to target them through the TTIP. We're going to see those as being unnecessary barriers to trade which need to be swept away if you want to get any traction in terms of this particular agreement. And I think what's also interesting there, we mustn't think of it just about sort of nasty old US and great EU in this respect. So I said at the beginning, this is not about an international relations issue. There are groups in California and other states who are desperately trying to improve labelling on GMOs so that they can see at least what genetically modified food are going into the things that they eat. They have said that they will get nowhere. If this TTIP goes ahead, even their incipient attempts to try to get GMOs labelled and regulated will be flushed away. So firstly, the food safety area is one which has been specifically targeted. Any sense that we would like to control what we eat or know what we eat would be flushed out the system. The second is in relation to chemicals and the environment. Again, radically different systems of regulation in Europe and the United States. You may be aware that just 5 years ago, 2007, the European Union passed its REACH regulations on chemicals in the environment and everything like this. And it was quite an important struggle because it meant that the European Union could enshrine the precautionary principle in its understanding of how you had to tackle chemicals in the environment. So if you're not sure, if you can't prove that these chemicals are safe, the principle is that you should presume they're unsafe and avoid them. The opposite pertains in the States. In the United States, they have this TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, I think it's called, and that takes exactly the opposite position. That basically, if you can't prove it's unsafe, then it's fine for businesses to continue using it. And it's exactly that they're trying to push through now in the trade talks. They've already tried to challenge the European Union's regulations at the WTO, and they've now said that they're going to try and push this through very strongly in TTIP. Again, you know, there are US groups who are concerned that this is going to stop them making any progress in trying to reform their own toxics legislation. So it's going to be hitting people and the environment on both sides of the Atlantic and giving firms much greater freedom to be able to use these chemicals with impunity. The third sector, finance, the banks. This you can't really credit because the one thing you've learned from the financial crisis and crash of 2007-2008 is that the deregulation of the financial sector sparked exactly the chaos and the crash of financial markets. And yet, through the TTIP, financial services have been absolutely included at the centre of TTIP, and they are one of the areas where they're pushing for deregulation. In fact, it's better to say re-regulation, because the idea is they want the system to be re-regulated in favour of capital. So the banks have more freedom to be able to repatriate capital. They don't have to worry about the new restrictions which are being brought in. And interestingly here, it's on the US side that they're bringing in more restrictions. They've had much tighter rules in the US than they've had in Europe. And it's the UK government, prompted by the City of London, which is doing its utmost to try to get those new regulations watered down. So again, it cuts both ways. And that includes even restrictions on capital flows. The idea of the introduction of capital controls which has been acknowledged now as being so important when you've got the threat of financial crises, that your government should have some form of control over the flight of capital out of its jurisdiction. Even the IMF, which has preached the gospel of capital account liberalisation, since time began, even they have recanted and said, we recognise we've gone too far on this. And yet through TTIP, the banks and the other financial services industries would be able to see a further liberalisation of the sector in their advantage. The next sector, the public services, we touched on them already, absolutely critical for us, particularly around issues like the health service. The National Health Service, which is absolutely and explicitly in the firing line of the big US health firms. And this has been right back since the 1990s. They've said, we see these ideas of public health systems which are created and held together by risk pooling and cross-subsidization. We see these as the prize. Not the little bit of whatever it is in this country, 11%, 12% who use private sector medicine. That's sort of marginally interesting. But the big prize is the NHS. And to break up the NHS, to try to have access to the most profitable bits of it, and leave the public sector to deal with the most difficult and the most expensive bits. And again, this idea of pushing in and trying to break up public services also includes the big pharmaceutical companies who want to try and come in, get rid of the license to use drugs and to get cheaper variants, and instead put in tougher patents so that national health systems can't get access to those. And you hear from the European Union and others, oh, actually it's okay, because public services are exempted from TTIP, because we're using the same exemptions we had under the WTO rules on services in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, on GATS. But that's a wonderful fiction, born of deliberate amnesia. We went through exactly these debates 10 years ago, and we said, you know that the exemption for public services that pertains at the WTO is absolutely meaningless. You know it. It does not cover public services, which is why you've put in a specific clause saying we need to get extra cover for public services. And of course they've now conveniently forgotten that. So when they're telling you it's okay, public services are not included in this, it's a direct falsehood based on forgetting all of the debates we had 10 years ago. Two more other sections I want to just quickly talk about. One is, again, intellectual property rights. Again, very much central to how corporations see their trading opportunities and their profit-making opportunities restricted. And so they're pushing very hard to try to force through intellectual property rights which will restrict the terrain that we have, and particularly privacy, and open up greater opportunity for profit. Many of you will maybe know more than I do about the ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which is being promoted by companies in the States and elsewhere, as again, this idea of trying to restrict people's privacy, so that internet service providers, for example, would be recast as a frontline police force to try to capture people who infringed in intellectual property or anything else at all. And the ACTA, this Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Act, was defeated, actually. It was thrown out by the European Parliament last summer. Well, all of the provisions are foreseen to come back through TTIP again. Similarly, jobs. What about jobs? One of the key claims of those who are promoting TTIP is you're going to get 2 million new jobs as a result of this. And again, this is entirely fictional. We know this from all of the experience of NAFTA, which was sold to the North American and Mexican peoples on exactly that basis. They were told this is going to be a real stimulus for jobs. It's going to mean every working family is going to see all this extra bits of money. It just does not pertain. What we've seen over there is millions and millions and millions of jobs go in Canada, in the US, and in Mexico. And some of the research that Monde has done is looked across the world in other forms of trade liberalisations, and again and again and again it's clear. What you see is the returns to capital increasing and the returns to labour decreasing. Not only do jobs get lost, but wages are repressed, and people actually end up being transferred into lower and lower unpaid jobs. So you get skilled workers transferred progressively lower down as they lose their jobs and the jobs are relocated. So undermining workers' rights is an absolutely key element of this. But the final thing I want to say about the content, and it's something which Susanna mentioned right at the beginning, is this concept of a new investor-state dispute settlement mechanism which is introduced by TTIP. What is that? It's absolutely crucial to this, but it needs a little bit of explaining, and this is something I do at rather more length in the book, because this is something where we have some experience of how investor-state dispute settlement works. Traditionally, as at the WTO today, if a country has a problem with another country's trade or investment rules, the country A takes country B before a court. And that is the traditional rule. Basically, countries act as the representatives of their peoples when it comes to international trade and investment rules. On the other hand, if you're a company and you've taken out a contract with, let's say, the borough council somewhere, and you feel that that borough council has cheated you or you've somehow been infringed, you can take that borough council to court for the infringement of your contract. You have a contractual relationship with them. If you think they've diddled you, you can take that up at a local court or a domestic court. What the new generation of bilateral investment treaties brought in was an idea that the investor company should be elevated so that its status is equivalent to that of the sovereign nation state. And that means that now, under these bilateral investment treaties, each of these companies, even if they don't have a contract with the local borough or the national entity, they can take the country to court. They can take it before an international arbitration tribunal made up of 3 judges with absolutely no public tenure or no public accountability, who can then rule and can then prescribe damages. And this has been an extraordinary shift in the balance of power, which has just taken place, particularly over the last 20 years. And you've seen some countries, like Argentina, hammered, one after the other, with different companies coming in and saying, we're going to take you to these international tribunals, and finding in their favour $100 million here, $200 million there, $300 million there. Attack after attack after attack. But what's also really interesting is it's not just poor southern victim governments or whatever you want to see. Germany is the one which is under the microscope at the moment. As you may remember, at 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, which left 20,000 people dead, and the Daiichi nuclear plant blown up and still in crisis. As a result of that, the German government decided not to renew its nuclear power facilities after 2022, which is when they were due to be phased out. So the the German parliament said, that's enough. We can see the risks of nuclear power. We do not wish to entertain this anymore in Germany, and we're going to get rid of it. A Swedish company, Vattenfall, which had operated previously 2 defunct German nuclear power plants, has sued the German government for 3.7 billion euros because it is saying that as a result of their decision to phase out nuclear power from 2022, Vattenfall risks losing all of these profit opportunities. Absolutely astonishing that a public policy like that should be held to ransom by a company simply because it would lead to its commercial disadvantage. And the problem is, Vattenfall has tried this once before on Germany and succeeded. So this is the second time. The first one they went through, it was in relation to a coal-fired power plant on the banks of the Elbe, just outside Hamburg. And again, Vattenfall said, all of these environmental regulations and conditions you're putting on us, it means it's not commercially viable for us to run this plant. And the Germans said, well, hang on, those are our regulations. And they said, well, we're going to take you towards this international tribunal, and it will find that actually you are in danger of expropriating us and causing us unfair and unequitable treatment. And so the German government backed down and relaxed all the rules for it. Vattenfall's now trying again with this new investor-state provision. That is what they're trying to bring in through TTIP, so that US companies will be able to come over to Europe even if they have no contractual relationship with us whatsoever, but they just say that their commercial opportunities have been harmed as a result of our labour rights, as a result of our environmental standards, as a result of our food safety standards. They can take your country to court and be given these whopping great big judgments in their favour to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds and dollars. And what that does, of course, is it means that it has a chilling effect on governments. Governments will not take certain measures which they would otherwise take for fear of what will happen. And this is a particularly key case at the moment in relation to tobacco. You may have heard that the Australian government, a couple of years ago, took the decision to put all cigarettes in plain brown packaging. So no more Marlboro, Camel, Rothmans, or whatever they still have. But it's all in brown paper packaging, which is their attempt to try to reduce the glamour of smoking. Philip Morris has taken them straight to an international tribunal court. They've also taken Uruguay to court for doing exactly the same thing. The British government said, we also like this idea of putting tobacco, putting cigarettes in plain brown packaging. But as a result of seeing what's happened to Australia, they've now pulled that policy and said, we're actually now, and said explicitly, we're going to wait to see what happens to Australia. So what you would see to be a perfectly viable public health policy, which we could choose to take in our own jurisdiction, is now being held to ransom because it could lead to one of these investor-state dispute attacks. Right, my final thing is, what can we do about this? What on earth can we do in the face of this horrific attack? And I think from that point of view we need to start with a good news message to begin with, because international outrage at these things has worked in the past. If you think back to 1998, it was an international campaign of action against the multilateral agreements on investment, which was trying to do a lot of these things back then, which succeeded. It actually saw that agreement torn up and all the negotiations terminated. Now, it wasn't just the international campaign, it was also some of the countries fighting amongst themselves. France is always our ally in these things, it seems, because it always seems to be the one which causes most traction, most resistance to it. So maybe the Monde Diplomatique is an important base from which we can launch these campaigns. But also, the Doha round at the WTO, the European Union and Japan tried their hardest to expand the WTO's agenda into exactly these areas: investment, government procurement, competition policy. Again, a massive campaign around the world saw that off. And the European Union ended up humiliated because its prime agenda item at the WTO was thrown in the bin. And the Western Hemisphere, after NAFTA, the George Bush government said it wanted to try to roll out the free trade area of the Americas, the FTAA. Massive resistance across the whole of the Western Hemisphere saw that torn up and thrown in the bin. So it is possible to resist these things and turn them back on themselves. And there are groups which are now currently trying to mobilize and trying to get some form of resistance on these different areas. But I think we need to be frank with ourselves. It's a massive undertaking. The European Commission and the US Trade Representative know that they can try and shift all this stuff through swiftly because everybody is struggling with very immediate problems and very immediate struggles in their own terrains. People in this country will say, we're fighting against a government which is cutting welfare, cutting social services, cutting jobs all the way across our lives in an immediate basis. How can we then also be thinking about this far-off threat of something which we don't really even understand because it's so complicated? And I think that's really our job. And one of the things that people have suggested we can do is to try to highlight to each of the different interest groups where the threat really lies to them. So, if we're talking about the Green Movement, really identifying to them the threats in terms of environmental damage. If we're talking about consumer groups, really identifying to them what the food safety implications are. Working with the trade unions to try and say, what is the threat to workers' rights and to jobs here? And then working with all of us in the public, and particularly those who are professionally engaged to save the NHS. The one thing you know people will come out and be most engaged about is if they feel that the NHS is going to be carved up and then handed over piecemeal to different US corporations. So I think we do have an opportunity to be able to rise up against the TTIP. Certainly, meetings where we can go and spread consciousness of it, because nobody's really heard of it, to be honest. Those are an essential first step. Linking with other groups, trade unions and others who can mobilize in large numbers is essential. And also explaining to them the real level of threat, because within the trade union movement, there are still a lot of people in this country who quite like the idea of TTIP. Certainly from the top of the trade unions, the idea that it's a very bad thing is not what you often hear. You often hear there are lots of things wrong with it, but we like it in its general terms, which I think is profoundly wrong. So basically what I was going to try and end with was this note of optimism. Calculated optimism. We can stop these things. We can hold our governments to account. Even if we don't have levers through which to hold the European Commission to account, because it dances to a completely different tune, we can hold our government to account. And we can make this part of a broader resistance which says we do not want to have a future which is handed over to massive corporations, handed over to capital to accumulate more and more and more wealth at our expense. Building a grand coalition to fight against the TTIP is within our power, but it will take all of us, I think, to be engaged to make it work. And Monde stands ready to work with whoever is going to be happy to join this fight. We haven't obviously got anything like the capacity to make a success of it ourselves, but if we do it together, not just in this country, but also with all of our colleagues across Europe and in the United States who are already mobilizing on this, then I think we can make a real difference. The ultimate news is we have to. This is a massive threat, and we have to defeat it. Thank you very much.